Today's guest on the podcast is the Reverend Jeff Grant. I heard Jeff on Rich Roll's podcast just a couple of days ago, actually, and I reached out to him and was like, come on my podcast. And we booked it like within a couple of days, and it's so super awesome and thrilled that he took the time to come play in my playground for a little bit. But the Reverend Jeff Grant, he is an ordained minister with over 3 decades of experience in crisis management, business, law, reentry, and recovery. He's almost 2 decades sober, and he spent time in prison for white-collar crime and addiction. He didn't go to prison for addiction because you don't go to prison for addiction, but that's kind of part of the downward spiral that happened that led him to prison. And his current ministry, you can check him out at prisonist.org. as in feminist, but prisonist. And the work that he and his wife are doing with white-collar crime and criminals in the family and kind of aftermath for healing and recovery for all sorts of individuals who are suffering from addiction and just the aftermath of these crimes and the family ripple effect and impact. It's really interesting work and much needed in our world. Honestly, anytime someone stands in their truth and tells their story and then heads out to help other people as a result, it's incredibly inspiring. So I hope you enjoyed this episode with the Reverend Jeff Grant.
Welcome to the Same 24 Hours podcast with Meredith Atwood. We all have the same 24 hours each day, and it's what we do with those hours that makes all the difference between our health, happiness, and success.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Same 24 Hours podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Atwood. Today's guest is Reverend Jeff Grant. Hi.
Hi, Meredith. Thanks for having me on.
Excellent. I'm so glad to speak with you. I heard about your story on, obviously, Rich Roll. I'm sure everyone's telling you that now.
Yeah. There's been a lot of action.
I know. And I thought the second it came out and I listened to it, I was like, I better ask this guy quickly because he's probably going to get really busy. Yeah. So I appreciate you taking the time. The thing that really struck me about your story, and that is a lot of people's story, is how we kind of come from rock bottom to then be our best selves and to help other people. So let's talk a little bit about your story as far as addiction and your career and kind of how this all started.
Sure. I was a successful lawyer in New York City and then moved up to the suburbs. We already lived in the suburbs, but moved my office up there and kind of started to do very, very well. And representing some large real estate companies, some companies that regionals, so I'm not sure you would have heard of, but certainly Metro New York area. Mm-hmm. And in the course of representing one, I played a pickup basketball game with the property director of my client, and I ruptured my Achilles tendon, and it was ugly. And I went right down, but at that point I'd been sober for about 5 years. I certainly didn't have the kind of raging addiction I wound up with.
So what were you sober from? Like, what was the first round? Alcohol?
Just a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
I mean, not literally everything, but I was a kind of a normal guy. I smoked some pot, and there were years when I had back in the club era. I had done some cocaine and things like that.
Yeah. But
when I went down, I just wanted painkillers, and I asked the orthopedist for them, and he gave them to me. And when I no longer needed them therapeutically, I searched for other doctors who were friends of mine or colleagues, and I wouldn't say that. I don't know if it was right to say they were happy to give them to me, but they did, mm-hmm. and they did for the next 10 years, and for often, sometimes multiple times a week, and I was hooked.
So how long ago was this?
My injury was in 1992, and so it was from 1992 through 2002, and as I got deeper into my addiction, my ability to perceive things changed and to show up at work changed, and my health deteriorated, and there started to be money issues. And the day came when there wasn't enough cash in the to make payroll in the business, and the deal I made with the devil was to invade the client escrow account so that we could make payroll. And from there, everything just spiraled completely down. And then when 9/11 happened, I took it very hard, mostly because my business was already failing. And I put in an application for a small business administration loan because I took the position that the decrease in our business was at least in part as a result of 9/11. And that was probably true, but mostly it was because of my rampant prescription opioid addiction. And I lied on that application. I told them I had an office in New York City, and I didn't need to tell them that at all, because in Westchester, where my office was in a county that had been affected, and I would have gotten the loan anyway.
Oh, wow.
So there you go.
And you had some time to think about that small detail, didn't you?
Well, the thing is that the things I did, I never would have let a client do.
Right.
I mean, I was done. I was crazy. And the drugs were just not allowing me at all to focus. And then when the money came in, and it came in pretty promptly, it was $247,000. The first thing I did was pay off credit cards that I had run up to try to, save my business, even though I should have known there was really no saving it. And I wasn't allowed to use those SBA funds to pay off personal credit cards either. So it was everything, all my thinking was crazy. And I knew this. I mean, of course, I had sophisticated business clients.
Right.
It's
and especially
crazy.
As a lawyer, I mean, the second you touch your escrow money,
Oh, yeah.
You're at the bottom.
Yeah, and what I didn't know, this is what I didn't know, was that I had I had a case of undiagnosed bipolar disorder. And honestly, it's not like, I don't know about anybody else's bipolar disorder, but mine greatly affected my mood and ability to focus. And I had been self-medicating. Mm-hmm. And so there it was, and almost anything that was that difficult or that was pushing me over the edge. Right. And so I understand it now, but it's not like I blame the drugs or I blame the bipolar disorder. It's not a blame thing.
Yeah.
It's
so
just,
when you were, I'm 3.5 years sober. So,
oh, congratulations!
Thank you, and I know how tenuous that is and how it can go at any time. And it's interesting that you were sober for 5 years, and then this injury projected you back into that life. But when the first round, like when you knew you had a problem, what was it? Do you think it was the undiagnosed bipolar disorder that kind of drove you to the self-medicating? Was it just stress? Because I always find it really interesting when people become addicted.
Well, I pretty much had an addictive personality anyway. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And over the years, my friends who I had partied with, they were stopping, but I wasn't.
Right. If one is good, 10 is better.
Yeah, and the truth is that I had no real perception about any of that whatsoever. I just was living my life, and my life included some drinking and included some so-called recreational drugs, but it got out of hand in the mid 1980s, which is when my first attempt to get sober. and I went to see a therapist, and I saw him pretty regularly. And that's when I stopped drinking and stopped doing drugs, but I never went to AA, and I never saw a psychiatrist. I just saw him, and I definitely credit him with saving my life at that point. Mm-hmm. But I think that I would have been served by being introduced to some other things like AA and psychiatry. But that didn't happen until later, and so that's just the way it is.
Yeah. So what happened as the downward spiral continued?
Let's see. So now I'm the subject of a investigation into my finances, and I'm trying to save my law firm. And the day it became clear that could no longer happen. And I had already offloaded my staff, and I'd offloaded my clients, and I've offloaded everything about the law firm because I wanted to find them a safe home, and I was able to do that. And now I'm pretty much alone in my office, trying to figure out what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. And I got some disturbing news about a ex-business partner of mine who had sent some very damaging information to the character committee, and there was and he was right. I mean, I wasn't, and I don't blame him either. And all of which I did pretty much, I guess, in a stupor. And I told my ethics lawyer to resign my license, and that was the night I got my last prescription. And that night I tried to kill myself.
Wow.
So that was pretty grim. Maybe very grim, I guess. I don't want to. I don't want to. I don't want to.
It's like 20% grim. That's really.
I mean, it was bad.
Yeah.
And so, I went to rehab for a bunch of weeks, and I remember sitting on the front steps of the rehab, and my daughter's looking at me like I was a Martian. Like, this is not the dad we know. This is not, what are you talking about? And, I just had to tell him the truth. Or the truth as I knew it at that point anyway. Of course, in the program, it took years for the truth to really come out.
Well, I thought what was so interesting about, and not that it's probably not the right word, but the interesting about your suicide attempt was you tried to OD on pills. It, quote unquote, didn't work, and you just woke up the next day and dealt with it.
Well, I woke up, in a pool of vomit.
Right.
But candidly, it wasn't the first time I'd ever woken up in vomit. I mean, this is that's getting real, but
right.
But I had never taken anything like the volume I had taken that night.
And how much was it? You had a high tolerance at this point, right?
I mean, yeah, but literally it was 40 hits of Demerol.
Oh my gosh.
So, I mean, that,
Yeah.
I mean, that should have been enough. And I'm speaking like I'm disappointed, but that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that I actually thought it would be enough.
Right.
And
no, it's funny. I talked to a lot of suicide survivors, myself included, and you kind of just have to joke about it. I mean, it's grim, but I get it. I'm not taking your humor as...
All right, I'm going to tell you something that's going to blow your mind.
Okay.
Because the first time I published the story about this, I heard from the suicide survivor community, right? And this is unbelievable, that I am not a suicide survivor. I am a suicide attempt survivor. Suicide survivors are the families of people who actually commit suicide.
Yeah, that's true.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah.
I mean, just to think that there's that distinction even in the language.
That's true.
I know, it's really
Suicide
weird.
attempt survivor. No, that's good. See, educated every day.
I'm telling you,
Every day, yeah.
and I had chills because there are families out there whose loved one has actually killed themselves.
Right.
You know, and that would have been my family. That would have been my kids. You know, so
and at the time, you're not even thinking clearly. You're not. You don't even know. Like at that point, life felt so dismal to you. It was over. Your license was gone. Your business was gone. So what did it look like as you sat on the steps of rehab and looked at your daughter, and what was that like?
Well, mostly it was I was still insane, and they had started me on bipolar meds, so I was a little, hazy from that. But in a way, there was also kind of a relief. Like whatever I was running from, I'm not running from anymore.
Right.
Like it was exhausting for the 3, 4, 5 years before that. I don't know how many years, looking over my shoulder and hoping I wouldn't get caught and trying to hide the vials of these pills, and oh my God, it was exhausting. And now I'm in this place where, they're charged with keeping me safe.
Right.
Like, wow. And I don't know that I was able to, formulate all those thoughts back then, but I certainly knew that I was, that I had some sense of relief.
So how long were you in rehab?
Well, it actually, it was 7 weeks total, but there were, I was, after the first couple of weeks, they let me out to go to IOP. It's intensive outpatient for anyone listening who doesn't know what that is. And I didn't last long. They in IOP, they told me I had to come back.
How come? What did you do?
Well, there is a story, of course, because right. If you've been in the program 3.5 years, you already know that there's a story for everything.
Right, of course.
Right. And in this case, what happened is that there in Westchester County, you could be on parkways and go in a big circle, from all the way around the county. And on my third or fourth loop on this highway, because I couldn't figure out how to get off the highway, and I called them up on the car phone, and I said, I called up my counselor. I said, "This is what's going on," and they said, and they gave me directions to the hospital.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, I'm telling you, I was out of my mind.
Wow. Yeah. So you went back.
I went back. Does everyone get this candid on this show?
Man. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I had Amy Dresner
good.
on. I don't know if you know her. She wrote the book My Fair Junkie, and she.
Oh yeah.
Oh my gosh. It doesn't get more candid than me.
Oh, good.
Like you and I are just scratching the surface. It's fine.
Well, we can go deeper. That's
it's
okay.
Fine. No,
yeah.
I mean it's funny. Just like when you were telling that story, I had a memory of a time that I was driving to Atlanta. I don't know why. Mm-hmm. And I was alone, which means my husband was somewhere else. And I was blitzed out of my mind. Not good to be drinking and driving, but it's part of my story. And I had to call wherever I was going. I think it was a restaurant. And they had to give me directions because I couldn't see my GPS.
Yeah,
I couldn't figure it out. It was just too complicated. And this person at the restaurant, I remember they kept repeating and it was just so frustrating. So, I mean, it's like you look back on it and think, oh, that's not funny. But you were in that situation, living it, and it was terrifying and you couldn't figure it out. And there's a lot of those stories.
See, what people in the rooms don't know is that half the time we're laughing. And, it's not really funny as much as it is laughing with identification.
Right.
The how ridiculous we were and how ridiculous so many of us still are.
Right.
Until we mature enough until we start to become, some kind of getting close to the person that God intends us to be.
Right. And like I have a good friend, Katie. I'll tell her name. She is not of the addict brain. She's a normal person that just doesn't think this way. And so she listens to my podcast, and after she listens, she'll go, send me all the brain exploding emojis. She's like, what the heck? Because like when I talked to Amy, like I talked about how I have all this eating disorder issues and how I really considered developing a cutting problem in hopes that would cure my eating disorder. And Amy and I laughed about it, because it's just so ludicrous. Like that's how addicts can think. And so my friend Katie sends me a text. She's like, are you okay? And I'm like, no, I'm fine. I'm not, but some people just they can't comprehend the insanity.
Of course not.
But it is
I was bulimic for 25 years.
Oh, that's so rare that guys say that.
Yeah, well, that's the thing is that I never had a guy, and it was only once I came into AA that I heard women talking about it. And I felt like I could talk about it, and it wasn't something I regularly talked about in AA, but certainly enough that a woman reached out to me and offered me a lifeline to go to Overeaters Anonymous and kind of work through. And what people don't know about, at least with people with eating disorders, or at least about me, is that it's the loneliest thing in the world. Mm-hmm. It's all about shame and trying to control things that everything's out of control. And the one thing thought I could control neurotically was when I was binging or purging, and it was terrible.
Yeah.
And I haven't done it since I got sober. So now it's not only 17 years of sobriety, it's also 17 years since that.
Wow.
And I was talking to my therapist about it, and he said to me, well, do you think those two things are related? Because you know how therapists talk.
Yeah, they don't ever tell you anything. They want you to come. I'm in therapy for the first time, and I'm more frustrated than ever about my damn life.
Right, it's true. It's like taking a deposition.
Jeez, quit being an attorney, so I didn't have to do this shit. Why are you?
So you think those two things are related? Yeah. And I said, well, like probably. I mean, like right, everything's related. Everything's related. And he said, and this is what he said to me. He said, you're probably all that time you were doing you were doing opioids. You probably were making yourself nauseated, and without the nausea, you were self-perpetuating this cycle.
Yeah.
And the truth is that I haven't felt that inner urge, that inner thing. I haven't felt it in sobriety. So weird.
That's so interesting. And I always wished, and this is another just like messed up plane of it all, but I could never make myself purge. And I was too lazy to be like an exercise purger. So like I would get so mad at the bulimics in my life that could throw up. Because I was like, this is not fair. I was like never into like the not the hemorrhoid, but the suppositories, the laxatives. But I just like I always wanted to be able to purge, and I never could, and so mine would turn into just self-hate. Like I would internalize mine.
Well, I'm sure your listeners are loving the purging laxative conversation.
Oh yeah, man, they can turn it off. It's fine.
But
it's fine.
But the thing is that I wasn't thin.
No, bulimics aren't though, are they?
No. I mean, it wasn't like a runway model kind of purging thing. You know what I mean? This is like I was just eating as much as I could, and then somehow in my mind thinking I was making up for it.
Well, beyond like not to be your therapist, but I mean, do you think it was related in a way other than physical, other than the nausea?
Oh yeah. Oh, of course. Oh, of course. No, yeah, of course. I mean, it was at the bottom of all of this stuff, even about drug addiction, and certainly with the guys I work with, who, in the white collar ministry, we haven't gotten up to that part of the story yet. But it's always about some kind of lack of love and lack of acceptance and childhood rejection. Yeah. It's always
there it is. Yep. Okay, so let's fast forward to your because I want to talk about that. That's good stuff. So, not to interrupt you, but I just interrupted you. So whatever. What can I do now? I already did it.
Hey, we do have 24 hours. I saw the name of the show.
Oh, I didn't tell you that this is actually a 24-hour podcast?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Real time with...
Right. So you had a buddy that real time, all day, 24 hours. We're not on any sort of drugs doing it either.
Right.
Okay, so you had a buddy that kind of reported you got sober.
Yeah.
And you were in the clear. Life was fine.
Exactly. And I'm a good, at that point, a good AA soldier. I'm going to 3-4 meetings a day. I went to over 1,200 my first year, and then another 1,200 my second year. And I don't know that that's a lot by newcomer standards, but for people who've never addressed their issues, to think that you would actually go 3 times a day is, it seems monumental, and it is monumental. But I was staying sober, and I didn't. The money I had borrowed from the SBA, I had never even. It was completely blocked out of my mind. I'm talking about complete denial. And I got a call one day from some federal agents who told me there was a warrant out for my arrest in connection with the misrepresentations I had made on that loan application. And over the course of the next few weeks, turned myself in and got arraigned. And now I was someone with a criminal justice problem. And I knew I was going to plead guilty. And we just tried to work that out in a way that was as elegant as possible, because there wasn't going to be trial or anything like that. And I did plead guilty. And then, as it turns out, I had to wait 2 years to get sentenced.
Oh my gosh!
And that wasn't because of any complications in my case, because sometimes there are defendants who have co-defendants, or it's a very complicated issue, and so they have to wait a long time. I know people who are waiting 5 years to get sentenced, for example. But that's because of the sizing or complexity of the issues, like large hedge funds and things like that. But for mine, it just so happens that in the interim time, there had been a Supreme Court decision regarding the sentencing guidelines, and that they were going to be no longer mandatory, but only advisory. So for over a year, not one defendant in the federal system got sentenced. So I was just one of them.
But that probably worked in your favor, didn't it? Was there mandatory for yours, or?
Well, it turned out to be pretty much the same thing, because I was sentenced. My guidelines were, I think, 24 to 27 months, and I got sentenced to 18 months, and primarily because of the work I had done in the interim. So I was almost 4 years sober when I went to prison. But I credit all of my success. I credit even the downward departure in my sentencing with being in AA and the service I did in AA and just showing up and being a member among members and having commitments and sponsees and sponsors and everything. So it was. It worked in my favor, at least to that extent, because I was able to show a transformation at that point. But of course, it would have been great to get it out of the way and move forward with my life earlier. I mean, you take Martha Stewart, for example. She got she made a deal, whatever everyone makes a deal, but there's a plea bargain for her to plea. And within 6 months, she was doing her time and did her time and came out fast. Mm-hmm. And because that was a tactical decision as to how to put her on the best track. And she had very high-priced lawyers who understood that, and she was making a decision as a billionaire would. But not everybody has the opportunity to think that clearly and to have attorneys of that caliber.
And where were you kind of in your career or finances at this point? I mean, what were you working? I mean, was everything still kind of a mess with that?
Everything was a mess. I had sold, I had a bunch of businesses and things. So I'd sold businesses and retired and done all kinds of things. But before I went to prison, then I spent 13 and a half months actually in the prison. And that was an amazing transformative experience. It was, I don't recommend it. I don't think it's a good thing for anybody necessarily, but I understood that it was part of my recovery. And that's only something that you could understand. Having, as you know, I was about this. At that point, I was about the same length of sobriety that you are now.
Right, and I would understand that. I don't think I did any white collar crimes. I don't think so. But I can imagine that if someone presented me with evidence that I had, I'd be like, well, yeah, gotta go do this. I got.
but you'd understand it as part of your recovery.
Yeah.
That to me, it wasn't the punishment. It was something that was real and something that the more I accepted and surrendered to, the more successful I could be. And so I started a program of recovery inside prison for myself.
Oh, did you?
For myself, because there are very few resources in there. So what I did was, once I got into the prison, I had 3 goals that I was going to accomplish in the 13 or 14 months I would be there. One each for mind, body, and spirit. And that meant every day I had to work on each of those goals. And for my body, I wound up walking around the track 14,000 laps, which was the equivalent of, which was 3,500 miles, which is the equivalent of walking from New York to Los Angeles.
Oh my goodness.
And I did it in 10-mile increments. So that was 3 or 4 hours a day. I was on the track, walking the track in a circle. And I would listen to NPR or whatever I could pick up, because I was in the middle of Pennsylvania, but I was able to get the college radio stations and things like that. And then I would go to the library, because there's a library in the prison that was kind of like a junior high school library, but they had atlases and things like that. And I marked off the route in 10-mile increments. So every day I was walking, say, from, like on this leg, I'm walking from Akron to Cincinnati, vicariously.
Right.
And so I would learn everything I could about the destination I was going to. And so that just kept me busy.
So you're like a geography nut now.
Well, I always kind of liked atlases.
Yeah.
But the thing is that I was walking the track with people.
Yeah.
And these people were, they were in the most difficult positions of their lives, but so I didn't go to a camp. I went to real prison. And so there were guys from the inner city there, and there were drug dealers, and there were guys who were in MS-13, the gang, and I would walk and talk to them. It was fascinating.
Yeah.
There was this one Israeli guy I was walking the track with for a little while, as we're walking the track, he was looking around, and he said to me that it reminded him of living on the kibbutz. And I've never been to Israel, so I didn't know what a kibbutz really looked like. And he said, well, it looks like pretty much like this, except that on a kibbutz, the fences are there to keep the bad guys out. And here the fences are here to keep the bad guys in.
Wow.
And so it's all perspective,
Yeah.
I mean, and in truth, those fences did keep us safe. So it's, it's all perspective. And then for my mind, I took about 200 guitar lessons in that year, or in that 13 months. And I became pretty good on guitar. And I learned theory, and I was really able to experience a degree of mastery. I mean, I didn't become a master, but as my mastery increased, my joy increased. And I can play a pretty good guitar right now.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is cool. And that wouldn't have happened if I didn't have, the kind of monastic time to actually work on myself.
Yeah.
And then I found, a new connection with faith in God in there that led me into going to divinity school when I got out of prison. And
did anyone in prison impact you with that decision, or was it the time just kind of working on the spirit?
Well, I certainly got to experience a lot of religious services that I'd never experienced before, because everybody goes up to the education building on Friday evenings, say at 6 and 7 o'clock, with 2 different periods. And in that building, all the classrooms in there are turned over to religious services. So there's Islam and Brotherhood of Islam and Hindu and Catholic and Protestant and Jewish. And at the time, I was Jewish. And although I still consider myself Jewish, but I have been baptized, and I'm a reverend in Christianity, mm-hmm. but I still consider myself Jewish. And so I learned about a lot of that stuff in there. And it's not quite the same as out on the outside, because it's kind of like religion in a petri dish,
right?
But it's profound. People whose lives are living on the on the edge and the extremes, and so that was really, really powerful.
So divinity school, how was that?
It was hard.
Yeah,
it was hard. I think on the Rich Roll broadcast, I mentioned that it was harder than law school.
Yeah, you did.
And to me, it was much harder than law school. First of all, I'd been out of college. I'd been out of law school for 28 years at that point. So I didn't even know how to read. I couldn't read for 5 minutes.
Right.
And all this theological and ideological, and forget it. It was, but in law school, and for those of you who want to become lawyers, let me tell you, what course you're in. You're in contracts, you're in real estate, you're in torts. You know what course you're in. Right. And then pretty much the book tells you what you're going to read. So if you're in real estate, today we're going to learn about title. Tomorrow we're going to learn about the rule against perpetuities, whatever it is. You know what you're reading about. But the concepts in divinity school were so out there for me. So I'm reading about philosophers, and I'm trying to pull this all together, and my mind is not, I'm with kids who are half my age, who are, who steeped in the Bible and religious studies since they were kids, and it became a little bit difficult for that in that sense. But on the other sense, almost everybody in seminary is there for a reason, and mostly it's through some kind of personal suffering.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so from that standpoint, my best friend, for example, or one of my best friends in seminary was transgender, and early in the kind of transgender awareness movement, and they were suffering the same kind of stigmatization and shame that I was.
Yeah.
So, again, just like pretty much like AA, where
Right.
we identify with feelings, not facts.
Was it in seminary that you kind of decided and someone's mowing? Every time I do a podcast,
Yeah.
my neighbor knows I'm podcasting and he gets out his mower.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm just going to put a sign out. I'm
Yeah.
podcasting. Get your mower out. So sorry for that.
That's all right.
Buzzing. But what was it in seminary that you kind of saw the trajectory of where you were headed, or as far as your what you're doing now?
Not really. I mean, at that point, I was just trying to putting one foot ahead of the other, and my whole plan throughout my early sobriety was anywhere is better than where I am right now. So just keep moving forward, and kind of just give up the concept of having a plan, other than the fact that it will continue to evolve, and there's a serpentine path, and wherever it goes, it goes. And my job was to be in a state of readiness for the next opportunity when it presented itself. And for pretty much that was the case back then, before things started to come together. But because people don't know, people don't relate to the amount of preparation it takes to become an overnight success.
Right. Either that, or you just have to be stupid and like fall asleep while you're playing a video game, and then you become famous.
I guess that's true. But
no, yeah, totally.
I remember seeing on TV some running back on a football game who made this miraculous 98-yard run or something or other, right? And he was and he was being hoisted up on the shoulders of his teammates or something or other, and they said, how does it feel to be an overnight success or something like that? And he said, well, the 20 years it took to get here of lifting weights every day and playing a bit on a football field, right? That's what it took.
Right.
And that's how I was feeling, So after seminary, I was working in the inner city in Bridgeport at a church. And I was on the worship team, and I was on I had a prison ministry we started there, inner city. But I was living in Greenwich, Connecticut, which is I raised my kids in Rye, New York, which is the next town, and then right over the border is Greenwich, and which is probably, most people know, is one of the wealthiest communities in the country. And although I was living in an apartment, I wasn't living in one of these mansions. Mm-hmm. And but I was going to AA meetings, and for the 10 years, pretty much that from when I got sober to when this part of the story evolved, I probably worked with 100 guys who were in somewhere in their curve of going to prison or going through some kind of drug and alcohol / criminal justice issue. And in Greenwich, these guys were, they were wealthy, and they were hedge fund guys, and they were lawyers, and they were bankers, and they didn't really have, their problems were not dissimilar from the problems of the people I was working with in Bridgeport, right. But except in some ways they had it worse, because there was no support for them whatsoever. There was no community of support. There were no services. They were just, their lives were over, and they had to take this huge fall from grace. And I was seeing it from both sides. And I'd lived it now from both sides. I'm living it from both sides. And I was blogging about it at night, the craziness of these two communities, the one of the wealthiest and one of the poorest communities in the country, being in the same county and being only 20 miles from each other, and how I had a foot in each one, and how I was living this bifurcated kind of life. And a reporter from a hedge fund magazine came upon my blog and called me up. And he literally asked me, he introduced himself, and he said to me, "Are you the the guy who's the minister to hedge funders. and that was the first moment that there was a merger between all of these things. That that this could be a good idea.
Right.
And in some ways I'd been doing it anyway, but I just didn't really put that label on it. So that's what led my wife, and my wife Lynn Springer is my my partner, and in fact we're married 10 years last week.
Oh, congratulations!
Thank you. Yeah, which is a big deal, and I met her in the program, and so we at that point we did everything we could to try to figure out what this meant and how it could work or not work, and we made a lot of mistakes along the way, but we finally hit a groove now where we've worked with hundreds of families of people who've been prosecuted for white collar crimes. And the term white collar is kind of fluid. It doesn't really have to be a white collar crime or a financial crime. But if you have a financial guy or a lawyer or someone with a license who's got his third DUI and he's going to prison and a felony, he's not going back to work at that job anymore.
Right.
So it's really more about people who are disenfranchised and don't have another community in which they can attach to.
Because they really get rejected.
Yeah.
Right? I mean...
Yeah.
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 And their families and community and job and everything.
Yeah. I mean, I had been approached pretty early on by someone who knew the wife of one of the largest financial prosecutions, certainly in Connecticut. And this is New York metro area is a lot of prosecutions, and this is a lot of business. And her husband was in prison, and she was left with $150 in the bank, and she didn't know what she was going to do. I mean, what do you do? She's living in this big house, and she had no one to rely upon. She couldn't afford a lawyer. She couldn't afford accountants. She couldn't afford anything. And we were impressed by her, and we empathized with her, and we decided to take her situation on. And so I went to friends and friends of friends and put together a legal team and a forensics team, and we took on her case. And it was this beautiful combination of lawyering and ministering. And the lawyers donated, I would guess, $1 million worth of pro bono time.
Wow.
Because everyone kind of believed in the idea that the wives and children, or the spouses and children, are really the first victims. And because these people's money had been frozen by the government, that included her money and everything that she owned, even though it had nothing. She had her own money. She was, and they froze her money, so she couldn't even defend herself. And so we took this on, and we formed what became a group of people who take on the cases of innocent spouses, and that's still going on. And in her case, it was the first time in the country that a person's a spouse of someone being prosecuted for a white collar crime, the spouse's assets had been returned to her while the case was still active.
Wow.
So her life was altered irrevocably. I mean, it was no longer the big splashy life, but last I heard, she and her kids are living this nice, simple life and no longer under the specter of all this. And, that allows us to sleep well at night, thinking we did a good job for her. And we've been contacted by so many other spouses since then. And because it's it's an epidemic.
Right. So what have you learned about the concept of suffering in all of that you've been through and all that you've seen now? Because I think a lot of people might say, oh, yeah, the poor white collar families, the poor people that lived wealthy for 20 years. And have you found that it's kind of a hard sympathy to pull, or do you have a whole reinvented definition of suffering? Because I know my view of suffering has changed a lot over the last few years.
Yeah, well, that was happening in the program anyway.
Yeah.
But the thing is that there's certainly very little. When we started, there was no empathy and no compassion whatsoever for these families. None.
Right.
That's changed somewhat. It has changed. And I think part of that is because everybody we know, is one degree of separation from someone who has a legal problem or a criminal problem. If I walk into almost any conference or any time we're speaking anywhere in the country, or especially on the coasts, right? And I ask people, raise your hand if you have a friend or a family member who has been prosecuted for crime. Everyone raises their hand. Mm. So it's just the nature of the society that we live in, and people are there's a different degree of tolerance that's started, and I wouldn't say it's worked its way through to the workplace so much, because people still find it very hard to get jobs.
Right.
But certainly, I don't think there's the kind of stigma that was out there when we started. And I'd like to think that at least part of that is because of the work that we and some other people in this little corner of the world have done. But yeah. I myself, for example, I was on the board of directors of a major criminal justice organization, inner city criminal justice organization, not white collar. And in 2016, they asked me to step off the board of directors and become the executive director of the organization. And that would have made me the first person in the country who was incarcerated for white collar crime to become the CEO of a major criminal justice organization, or to be appointed as one.
Right.
And I had to talk to them. I said, you got to know what you're doing here. There's intended consequences and unintended consequences.
Right.
But they knew they were making a bold move, and it was I think it worked out. So not only was I an administrator and we were running a ministry, but I was a poster boy. And I had to take on the responsibility of that and be on best behavior. If this works, then the glass ceiling as to white collar criminals has lifted. The question of can we be trusted, has been answered, at least in small part. So that was important, and certainly part of this journey that, in the last 2 or 3 years, it was important, and now as a jumping off place where the conversation can get real with actual people who are living on the edge of all this stuff. Where I could go on your podcast or on Rich Roll's podcast, or there's a few magazine articles that are coming out in the next couple of months, and nobody's really interested in the sensationalized headline anymore. Everyone wants to get into the guts of it. Mm-hmm. Like we do in AA. And it feels good to be able to talk about it on a human level, that we're all suffering, and you don't have to be strapped to the side of a mountain with a bird pecking at your liver every morning. That imagery doesn't have to be there. It doesn't have to be mythic. We're just people.
Right.
And all kinds of, we've been through hell. And even if it's a hell of our own making.
Right.
It's still hell.
Still hell. Let's circle back to you mentioned the addiction and kind of trajectories of bad decisions. Like, you have noticed and seen a correlation to childhood trauma and childhood and shame and stuff. This is all very new to me. I've kind of been slapped in the face with it over the last 4 months with certain guests and all sorts of stuff. So let's talk about that a little bit. What have you learned?
There definitely is a difference between what I've learned about myself and what I've learned in ministering to or counseling others. So it's all been this self-reflective journey, because I've learned about myself, much of it, through looking at them. And that's a very AA kind of experience too. I learned, I had very absentee parents, and there was a lot of addiction, a lot of mental illness in my extended family, and I didn't understand how that was kind of preying on me. I didn't know that. I mean, my mother was a party girl. She was like my mother was a spitting image of Connie Stevens. Beautiful, beautiful woman. And who had a difficult marriage. And she wanted to be free. And she became a travel agent, and she roamed all over the world. And I believe she loved me. And I was her eldest, so I probably got the best years of her life. That she was still kind of interested in being a mother. But after that, she was literally all over the world. And we just saw her briefly, while she was kind of unpacking and packing for the next thing. And at her funeral, after her funeral, at Shiva, when she had moved to Florida, my childhood next door neighbor was her best friend. So we lived in the houses next door to each other in Long Island, and we got a chance to talk to this woman. Now it's it's 50 years later. I'm 50 some odd years old at that point, and so she's probably in her late 70s or in there somewhere. And we said, like, what's the story? I mean, because my brother, my sister, and I never really understood the story. And she told us, she said, I used to tell your mother that she was killing her children.
Oh my!
And she didn't change her behavior. She just wanted to do what she wanted to do. And there's a lot of years of blame about that with my mother. And my father was his own kind of checked out, bewitched Larry Tate kind of guy, very checked out guy. Mm-hmm. And, but no more blame anymore. Nothing like that. Just more, I want to see how it affects my decisions, and anything hysterical is historical. Right?
Yeah.
And so, when I'm feeling rejected or abandoned somehow by someone in my life, it's usually not about what's in front of me.
Right.
It's usually about tapping into those unresolved things from my childhood. So I've spent a lot of time in therapy, trying to clear them. And I have therapists, my current one, who practices, EMDR and tapping and whatever. And I'm open to anything. I just don't want to be. I just don't want to be in pain anymore, and I want to make better decisions. I want to be a better role model for my family.
Right. I think the biggest thing that childhood has taught me is that I can look at a current situation, a current pattern that I might be doing, and I can point to directly where it started and why I do that dumb thing or that pattern. You know, I'm trying to fulfill the need of X, Y, and Z that wasn't met, or trying to repair myself or disappoint. You know, I at least know where it started. And when I figured that out, it was like I could breathe for the first time in my life.
Yeah, wow.
Because you know, one, it's not your quote unquote fault. And now you have a choice in how you respond because you kind of know the deal.
Well, for whatever it's worth, what I've learned about me, and you may wind up learning about yourself, since I've been in therapy for 33 years, is that, this is whatever level of awareness I'm at the current moment, I'm just passing through. Mm-hmm. There's going to be a new level of awareness somewhere down the line. And so what I'm committed to is the process.
Right.
And wherever that takes me. And sometimes it takes me into difficult places because I really, really don't want to work on that stuff.
Right.
I really don't.
You really, really don't want to. Really.
Right. Right. And generally those are the places where I most desperately need to work on. So there's a lot of trust involved. And there's pain involved, but it's the pain of like letting go. It's not the, and
right.
Because neurotically, I want to hold on to this stuff. It's, there's a sick comfort in it. It's what I know.
It's part of the story you've been telling.
Exactly.
When you have to change your story, things have to change, and that's scary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But there's things are so much better now. Oh my God. It's like but it took a long time.
Sure.
Yeah.
So where can people find out more about your ministry and your podcast and all of this so people can keep following you?
Well, the website is prisonist.org, Prisonist, like feminist or womanist. It's Prisonist. I guess I was lucky that was available when I when I bought the domain name.
Right.
Although I can tell you, nobody's ever called up trying to buy it from me. It is a little corner of the world that
it is. It's a small pond you got there.
Absolutely, and but prisonist.org, and everything's kind of there. The podcast is Criminal Justice Insider, and there's a link on prisonist.org to get to all the different platforms we're on too. We record Criminal Justice Insider live in a radio station in New Haven, Connecticut, near the Yale campus, on the first and third Friday of the month. So some people do listen live. I mean, certainly the Connecticut criminal justice community does. But for everyone else, it's a podcast like any others, and it doesn't have anywhere near the production value of Rich Roll's.
Nothing does.
Nothing does.
I mean, I've got a mower outside, like whatever. It is what it is.
But I have learned a lot from this from Rich Roll.
I'm sure. You know what's so funny? You just said New Haven, Connecticut. I have a funny story about that.
Yep.
When I was a junior in high school, my English teacher said, "You need to know things for cocktail party information." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And he said, you just need to know things. Like, for example, when someone says they went to Yale, you say, New Haven is lovely in the fall. And it was just so funny because I've never needed that. And you just said New Haven and I was ready to go, Yale is awesome. Like to use that cocktail party information. I didn't get to. But it's funny that you said that.
Well, New Haven is one of those areas that the dichotomy is present, because it is very, very poverty inner city. And at the same time, there's Yale.
Right.
And I mean, there's a lot of other things in between. But the point is that the juxtaposition of those things how they deal with one another in terms of as communities is fascinating. And so at any given time on our criminal justice show, we're pulling from people who've been to prison, and we're pulling from people who are somewhere in the academic world, for example, trying to do something about it. So it's a very so at least the local portions of that show are reflect all of that. But at this point, we also have national guests on, and people want to be on it. I think because Babs Rolls-Ivy, who's my co-host, and I, we've both been to prison. Mm-hmm. And so they know that they're going to, they make it tough questions, but they're going to get a fair shake. That's for sure.
Yeah. So what's one thing that you do in your 24 hours that sets your day up for success? This podcast is called The Same 24 Hours. And I like to ask my guests, like, what they do in their 24 hours that sets them up for their best health, happiness, and success. Okay.
Well, so I'm going to give you my non-AA answer. I'm not that it's not an AA because I hold sobriety and Alcoholics Anonymous at the center of my life. So right. So that's such an easy answer for me. But I'm going to try to give you a different answer. But even though I just cheated and told you what my real answer is.
That's okay.
So a couple of years ago, my wife and my stepdaughter became yoga instructors. And in my early years in AA, there was like no way I could meditate. There was I didn't even get how that was part of the program. But now yoga and meditation are a real part of our lives. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing how I feel like my brain waves have shifted into a way where I'm calmer and more reflective, and having that space of not thinking about poor me, or not thinking about the complexities of not just my life, but all the people I'm working with in their lives. It's just a cleansing. And I recommend to these guys who go to prison, I said, take it up now, because you don't know what you're walking into. And you could be walking into a situation where you don't have a lot of personal space, or you don't have the luxury of places to do anything. But you can always meditate, and you can always have a personal yoga practice.
Right.
And so for the people who actually take me up on it, I'm not the yoga instructor. I'm far from it. So, believe me, that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that to turn myself over to this, it feels like it's an extension of my higher power, an offering from my higher power. Right. And so, wow, what a difference that's made. And so we practice pretty much every day. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say probably 85% of my guests say that. And I have been a resistant meditator just because I do what I want. And no one can tell me what to do. But then,
you could want this.
I know. But then I had Emily Fletcher on the show, and I still haven't published her episode because I keep waiting to report, because I've been meditating. And I did it for 30 days, twice a day. And it shifted everything for me. And then I went into trauma therapy, and then I couldn't meditate because it was too,
of course, yeah,
too collision. So now I'm doing morning pages, which is a form of meditation when you think about it.
Yep.
But I haven't been back on the meditation, but I can tell that my body, I can tell a vast difference. So I need to kind of figure out how I can deal with the dark thoughts plus the meditation. I don't know when that'll be, but I'm with you. It was a game changer for me.
Yeah, I mean, there are times in all of this I haven't actually been able to, cross-leg meditate, eyes closed, kind of, like a Buddha. But certainly my practice of mindfulness has shifted completely, and I can be in a moving meditation or in a mindfulness kind of meditation when I'm driving a car.
Right.
You know, I'm no longer trying to speed past the exits. You know, I'm experiencing actually where I am.
Mm-hmm.
So that's huge.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you, Jeff. This was great. I appreciate you sharing your story and all the work you do.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Meredith. And thank you for the opportunity.